If you want to get faster at triathlons, the obvious answer seems to be training more. But for many amateur athletes, that belief is exactly what stops them from improving. In this video, I want to challenge a very common belief in endurance sport, that doing more training hours automatically makes you faster. We'll look at why so many amateur athletes fall into that way of thinking and why it often leads to stalled progress instead of improvement. And more importantly, I'll show you what actually helps triathletes improve over time. If you spend any time around triathletes, you'll start to notice a pattern. Big training weeks tend to get a lot more attention. So someone might share a 20-hour training week on Strava or post a 100-mile or 160-kilometre ride followed by a 10-mile run. And it makes you think, maybe I should be doing more, or maybe I'm under training. At the professional level, it's not unusual for triathletes to train 25 or even 30 hours per week. But there is an important difference here. Professional athletes structure their entire lives around training and recovery. They sleep more, they manage their stress carefully, they eat precisely for their training demands. For most amateur triathletes balancing work, family and responsibilities, that environment just doesn't exist. And that difference changes everything. So here's the key point to keep in mind as we go through this video. Progress doesn't come from how much training you can survive, it comes from how much training you can absorb. The logic of doing more training sounds very sensible. More training creates more stimulus creates more adaptation, and more adaptation creates better performance. But there's a missing piece in that equation. Adaptation only happens when training stress and recovery stay in balance. If your stress increases but your recovery stays the same, something else happens instead. Fatigue accumulates. And when you're carrying fatigue through most of your training week, improvements start to slow down dramatically. This is something I've seen repeatedly as a coach, and it's one of the reasons I've developed a simpler training structure that focuses on getting the balance right between training and recovery. But before we talk about solutions, we need to define something that causes a lot of confusion. Let's clarify something important. A junk mile is not an easy mile. Easy training is essential for endurance athletes. A junk mile is something different. It refers to training that you do when your fatigue levels are already too high, or training that has no clear purpose in the week, or training that compromises the quality of your important sessions, or training that mainly exists just to increase your weekly total. In other words, the problem isn't easy training, the problem is unnecessary training. At first, all those extra sessions feel productive, but they do create a problem over time. They make it harder to execute the workouts that actually improve your performance. So when you're obsessed with training volume, this is how things tend to unfold. You add more sessions, your training diary looks more impressive, and you feel proud of your consistency. But over a period of weeks or months, that does start to change. Your interval sessions start feeling a bit more flat, your top-end power never quite appears like it did before, and you find yourself carrying fatigue through most of your week. When that happens, your training week turns into a series of moderately hard sessions, but none of them are hard enough or fresh enough to really drive your improvement. This is where freshness becomes one of the most valuable resources in training, because when you protect freshness, your key sessions improve dramatically. When you erode it, everything else becomes average, and average sessions rarely produce exceptional performance. Professional athletes are mostly limited by their physiology, whereas amateur athletes are mostly limited by life. When you're juggling a busy life, your training depends on far more than just fitness. It also depends on sleep, work stress, family responsibilities, travel, mental load, nutrition, and if those factors increase, your ability to absorb training decreases. That's not weakness, it's just the reality of training with a full life, basically. And recognizing that reality is often the turning point for athletes who start actually improving again. So if simply adding volume isn't the answer, what should you focus on instead? Well, in most cases, performance improves when three things happen consistently. 1, easy sessions are genuinely easy, and that means that they can support recovery and aerobic development. 2, hard sessions are executed properly, which means you can hit your target pace, power, or effort. 3, recovery allows adaptation to occur. So the work you actually do makes you fitter because you recover and adapt to it. When those three things are in place, the training signal becomes much clearer. You're not just completing sessions, you're getting stronger from them. And if you're wondering how to structure a training week so that it actually works in practice, I'll show you a simple framework next. For many amateur triathletes, a sustainable baseline looks something like this. 2 swims, 2 bike sessions, 2 runs. So 6 purposeful triathlon training sessions across a week. That structure keeps frequency high enough for progress while leaving space for recovery and real life. For example, a training week might include a swim session with some higher intensity efforts, a second swim focused on endurance and technique, and then a bike session with higher intensity work and a longer endurance ride on the weekend, a steady endurance run, and another run that has some controlled interval efforts included. And also, if you've got time, 1 or 2 short but purposeful strength sessions around 15 minutes are really worthwhile. If you'd like to see exactly how that looks across a full training week, I've structured it like this in my beginner and intermediate triathlon training plans, and you can check those out at myprocoach.net or via the link in the description. They're designed to be affordable and they include email coach support for whenever you need guidance. So training volume still matters, but only when it's absorbable. For many age group triathletes, the biggest breakthroughs come from doing slightly less, but executing their key sessions much better. That often means removing unnecessary workouts, protecting sleep, allowing recovery between your hardest sessions, and staying consistent for months and years. Because consistency across years will always outperform overload for a few months. The real goal is not to see how much training you can tolerate, it's to see how much training you can adapt to. I'd be really interested to hear your experience with this. Have you ever increased your training volume and actually gone backwards, or found that doing slightly less helped you perform better? Let me know in the comments, I do read them all. And if you want to continue learning about smarter triathlon training, I've put another helpful video on screen right now that builds on these ideas. And if you want to go deeper into building consistent endurance fitness, make sure you check out the Beginner's Guide to Triathlon training playlist as well. Finally, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future videos designed to help you train smarter and race better. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.